The future of women's rights in Afghanistan, 1 year after the Taliban takeover. Since the 2001 removal of the Taliban regime, Afghan women and girls had unprecedented opportunities and made significant progress, especially in education, healthcare, and participation in the public sphere. With the U.S. withdrawal of the Taliban takeover on August 15th of 2021, women and girls face an uncertain future with draconian measures, including loss of gains made in all areas of economic, civil, and social life. Taliban rule has had a devastating impact on the female population at large, with monumental barriers to the participation across all public life, including law, politics, academia, with increased threats of gender-based violence, child marriage, and severe restrictions on the rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, including choice of attire. Furthermore, Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis has exacerbated the dire situation for women and girls who are struggling to survive while caught in a system of gender apartheid. Today, 1 year after America's departure, Afghan women and girls rightfully feel abandoned. The Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 specifically requires Washington to promote the role of women and girls in peace, security, and conflict prevention. The crisis in Afghanistan not only warrants a serious concern, but also poignantly raises these issues. It is therefore the crucial importance to protect Afghan women and girls as the Taliban continue to engage in human rights abuses. How can the international community support women's rights and the women, peace, and security agenda in the midst of conflict? And what strategic adjustments can be undertaken to elevate the voices of women and girls and keep their voices at the center of U.S. foreign policy amid ongoing Taliban suppression? These are some of the questions and topics that it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nina Ansary. Dr. Nina Ansary is an award-winning Iranian-American author, historian, and United Nations Women Global Champion for Innovation. She is the director of the World Affairs Councils of America Global Women's Lecture Series and the director of Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum Women's Leadership Initiative at the University of Cambridge. Her books, Anonymous as a Woman, A Global Chronicle of Gender Inequality, and Jewels of Allah, The Untold Story of Women in Iran, received multiple awards, including the 2016 International Book Award in Women's Issues, and the 2021 Benjamin Franklin Book Award in Interior Design and History. Nina is a recipient of the 2020 Columbia University Graduate School of Arts and Science Outstanding Alumni Award, the 2019 Ellis Island Medal of Honor, the 2018 Bernard College and Columbia University Trailblazer Award, and has appeared on CNN International, Fox News, Larry King, the BBC, Sky News, and been featured in a variety of publications, including Time and Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, CNN.com, and Teen Vogue. She has presented her work on women's rights at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, the London School of Economics, the UN Social Good and Girl Up Leadership Summits, and at Columbia, Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge University. Dr. Ansary holds an MA in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, and a PhD in History from Columbia University. She serves on the International Advisory Board of the Cambridge Middle East and North African Forum, a think tank based at the University of Cambridge, the Board of Trustees of Iranian American Women Foundation, and the Board of Directors of My Stealthy Freedom, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to the promotion of Iranian women's actions to secure their rights. She can be found on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And after reading that biography, I need to go back to school and learn a lot more, because it is my distinct pleasure and my humbling privilege to introduce Dr. Nina Ansary. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I don't deserve it, but thank you. That's very kind. And I'm thrilled and honored to be here at Colorado Springs World Affairs Councils. Thank you for having me. You've been nothing but gracious and hospitable. And I am very much looking forward to the opportunity to talk about the future of women's rights in Afghanistan 1 year after the Taliban takeover. It was August 15, 2021. Businesswoman Sadira Mushtaq was immersed in her work as the director of the Farabi Health Institute, one of the largest private health institutions in Afghanistan. She took great pride in being named one of the 10 most accomplished women in Afghanistan. She took even greater pride in having made a difference in the lives of countless young women during the course of her career. Sadira had trained literally hundreds of female health professionals, arming them for successful careers in medicine. However, that day, everything changed for Sadira. The Taliban entered Afghanistan's capital city and seized control of the country. As Sadira described it, when I heard the news that the Taliban had entered Kabul, I felt as if I fell and broke into pieces. I fell from a bright place into darkness with no light to be seen. Today, a year later, what has become of women and girls in Afghanistan? And more importantly, what does the future hold for them? And how can the international community possibly influence that future? Unfortunately, the darkness Sadira referred to a year ago has not lifted. Instead, life has turned into a kind of waking nightmare. Almost every day, more evidence emerges of Taliban's efforts to systematically strip away at the basic rights of millions of women and girls. Yet I believe the future of women's rights in Afghanistan has by no means been written. When viewed against the broader context and broader historical quest for gender equality, not just in Afghanistan, but also in my home country of Iran, there is still room for hope. And the world's governments, humanitarian organizations, and even every single one of us in this room can help. But in order to fully comprehend the magnitude of how the Taliban takeover has shattered the lives of millions of women and girls, we must first consider the many gains they had recovered since the Taliban's first reign of terror from 1996 to 2001. Life during the 2 decades of US involvement was far from perfect, but the trajectory towards gender equality was climbing indisputably upwards. Afghan women and girls could once again enjoy many of the basic rights that we as women in America often tend to take for granted. They could receive an education, work, participate in public life, and also enter into politics. The women even helped draft a new constitution in 2004, which reserved 27% of parliamentary seats for women. In 2009, the Elimination of Violence Against Women law was enacted, and the first all-women Afghan robotics team was created, becoming internationally known as the Afghan Dreamers. According to the Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Industry, more than 1,000 female entrepreneurs had invested approximately $77 million over the course of America's involvement in the country, creating more than 77,000 jobs. By 2021, women not only served in the government, but also joined the army, trained as judges, and worked as physicians, journalists, and lawyers. To the point where right before the Taliban took over, 60% of Herat University students were women. Today, 1 year later, almost all of these rights have evaporated. And today marks 364 days since the Taliban banned teenage girls from attending school. We have a video clip to show you before I continue.
Afghanistan's girls are distressed, many are in tears. A last-minute turnaround by the Taliban on allowing girls to attend secondary school has left many wondering about their place in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan.
Dreams for the future crushed once again. The Taliban's sudden reversal means girls above the 6th grade can't go to school until further notice. They threw our dreams in the dirt. We are girls and we want to become doctors or engineers, but they don't want us to study at all. Is it a sin that we are girls? Is it a sin that we study? Just a few hours earlier, these classrooms were filled with hope. Learning again after 7 months stuck at home. But by midday, the Taliban broke its promise, a decision that the UN has called a major setback for Afghan girls.
The Secretary General says that denial of education not only violates the equal rights of women and girls to education, it also jeopardizes the country's future in view of the tremendous contributions by Afghan women and girls.
The Taliban Education Ministry has offered little in the way of explanation, saying, in Afghanistan, especially in the villages, the mindsets are not ready. We have some cultural restrictions. Still, schoolgirls came by the thousands for opening day, a sign that many families do believe their daughters deserve an education. The Islamic Emirate says we must live according to Islamic laws. So they need to please open the schools. Because it is in the Quran that both men and women are allowed to continue their education and study. No matter what these girls want for their future, they must wait for the men in power to decide if it is possible.
Professionally, the situation is equally bleak. Most women have been barred from working, with those in high-ranking government or business positions the first to be terminated. The Ministry of Women's Affairs was closed down and headquarters repurposed to house the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. Yes, believe it or not, this is actually a legitimate governing entity today in Afghanistan, and it is notorious for its oppression of women. In almost every profession, women, no matter how qualified, have been replaced by men. The former principal of a private school described her anguish in the following way: "It is difficult to survive, my mental health has been destroyed, and my financial situation is terrible. I can't help my younger brothers to be educated. I feel like when you break something, from the inside I am broken. I am a working woman, and yet I am sitting in my home with nothing to do. It all feels so wrong." Essentially, the only women permitted to work are those professions that require interaction with other women, such as women in healthcare. But even they face restrictions. For example, female doctors and nurses can no longer interact with male patients or even their male colleagues. Restrictions on attire and movement are also increasing by the day. On May 7th, the Taliban ordered women to cover themselves from head to toe when leaving the house, including their faces. Leaving the house is becoming ever more difficult. Initially, women were required to be accompanied by a male chaperone or mahram in public. But recently, the Taliban decreed that women should only leave their homes when absolutely necessary. Violence against women has also increased dramatically. Women are arrested daily on grounds of moral corruption. Some are beaten, some are detained, and some simply disappear. It goes without saying that all these human rights abuses are simply unconscionable. And I only wish that I could stop here. But it would be impossible to talk about the plight of women in Afghanistan without describing the broader economic and food emergency confronting the nation. Fact is that decades of war and drought had already contributed to a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan even before the US withdrawal. Now, with most international aid frozen, economic sanctions, and approximately half the working age population prevented from working, the country is on the verge of collapse. In April, the United Nations reported that approximately 95% of the Afghan population did not have enough to eat. 25 million Afghans are currently battling poverty, and the average family in Afghanistan spends approximately 75% of its income on food. All these factors have exacerbated the crisis for women, and they have led to a surge in child marriage, sometimes forcibly by Taliban members, sometimes even by desperate mothers who are struggling to have their children survive. One Afghan mother described her heartbreaking conditions that compelled her to marry her 13-year-old daughter to a 30-year-old man. Afterwards, she despondently said, "At least she won't be hungry anymore." Perhaps where the crisis is the most visible is in the country's maternity wards. Over the past year, almost twice as many newborns have died after childbirth, and miscarriages have doubled because of hunger and stress. In one area, Badakhshan, the population of 200,000 has access to only 1 doctor and 5 nurses. Women in labor are routinely turned away because clinics don't have the capacity, and many of them die on their way to other hospitals. With foreign funds frozen, the main hospital has had to reduce its capacity by 1/3. This has led to a truly appalling situation in which some pregnant women even have to share cots. Can you imagine as women in labor having to share 1 cot? These kinds of atrocities paint a bleak picture of life for women and girls in Afghanistan today. Yet I believe their future remains to be written. That in spite the desperate situation, I don't believe all is lost. You may ask why I'm saying this. In order to understand what is going on in present-day Afghanistan, from a strictly historical perspective, it's important to go back to the early 1900s. Around the world, suffrage movements were gaining ground. Building on the successes of New Zealand and Australia in the late 1800s, women across Europe, the United States, and almost every continent began demanding their rights, and some governments began to respond. In 1980, the majority of women in Great Britain were granted the right to vote. A year later, another country followed suit. That country was Afghanistan. If this comes as a surprise to you, you're not alone. But if we step back and look at the past century, we realize a rich and complex history of women's rights already existed in Afghanistan, and it has been anything but linear. Rather, it has alternately ebbed and flowed, with promise at times only to recede at others. From this longer-term vantage, there is ample room for hope. Returning to 1919, suffrage was just one of the few reforms initiated by King Amanullah Khan during his 10-year reign. Eager to modernize Afghanistan, King Amanullah banned child marriage, promoted the education for girls, and even made the veil optional. His wife, Queen Soraya, became Afghanistan's first female activist. She founded the first school for girls. She also founded the first women's organization, as well as the first women's hospital. She also led by example, often appearing alongside her husband in public. Queen Soraya even took the bold move of unveiling herself in public, because she was eager to step out of the stereotypes and restrictions that had held the country back for so long. Unfortunately, these changes did not last long, and while they were embraced by a small segment of the population, they proved too much too soon for a vast majority unfamiliar and unaccustomed to such modernizing initiatives. In 1929, King Amanullah was forced to abdicate, and most of his reforms, including the right for women to vote, were repealed. This pattern of gender reform, followed by tribal and religious backlash, would be repeated over the ensuing years. Indeed, from 1933 to 1973, women's rights gradually but steadily increased under Afghanistan's last monarch, Mohammad Zahir Shah. By the 1960s, women were not only graduating from universities in record numbers, but also entering the workforce as lawyers, doctors, civil servants, and teachers. Women could be seen on the streets of Kabul wearing either Western attire or the veil. In 1964, women were once again granted the right to vote. The following year, the first 2 female senators were appointed, and from 1966 to 1971, 14 women became judges. But once again, progress did not last long. In 1973, Mohammad Zahir Shah was overthrown. During the course of multiple coups, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the installation of the communist government, women did continue to exercise some rights. But however, they were met with increasing hostility by the ever more powerful Islamic fundamentalists known as the Mujahideen. After the Soviet Union departed in 1989, the country descended into full-blown war, and the women's movement was one of its first victims. In 1966, the Taliban, with its notorious brand of gender apartheid, came to power for the very first time. The political pendulum had definitively swung toward repression. Believe it or not, this pattern of progress, followed by reactionary oppression, is not unique to Afghanistan. As a woman born and raised in pre-revolutionary Iran during a relatively liberal period, I left in the immediate aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and from afar I witnessed my country of birth radically shift, and with it the lives of its women. For over 4 decades now, women in Iran have challenged the gender discriminatory laws, oftentimes paying a high price to regain their rights and their right to self-determination. Much like Iranian women, Afghan women have refused to give up. When the political pendulum has swung toward reform, women have rushed to secure higher education and made significant strides in virtually every sector. When the pendulum has swung toward repression, they have found subtle, more subversive ways to pursue their cause. Which brings me to the following. How can the international community help? I'd like you to imagine a small room in a house in the outskirts of Kabul. It has been painted a cheerful yellow. A donated rug decorates the floor. 10 teenage girls, clad in black from head to toe, lean over their second-hand books, intently studying. They crave an education so much, they are willing to risk everything. They are attending school in secret. The school I've just described is run by a young woman who is not much older than the girls themselves. She is 21-year-old Nazani. She and other women throughout Afghanistan are finding ways to circumvent the Taliban's ban on secondary education. Some are branding their schools as madrasas or religious schools. Others are calling them tutoring centers. All of them are careful to abide by the strict dress codes and to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. The girls themselves learn about the schools from one another. One high-achieving student, Zainab, leaves home at 6 a.m. every morning to attend 3 different tutoring schools. She told NPR recently, "I get really scared when I see the Taliban guys. I try to change my routes daily for fear." Nevertheless, Zainab refuses to relinquish her dream of becoming a doctor one day. Stories like Zainab's and Nazanin's remind us that we simply cannot look away, that we cannot give up hope. The humanitarian emergency in Afghanistan demands urgent action. While permanent U.S. involvement was never the goal, withdrawing forces in such an irresponsible and hasty manner without cementing an intra-Afghan peace deal or taking any steps to ensure the protection of women and girls was a lamentable disaster. Today, I believe the United States and the international community have a responsibility to support the millions of Afghan women and girls who rightfully feel abandoned. First and foremost, we need to ensure that our efforts in no way legitimize the Taliban. Farah, a young woman from the Logar province, put it this way: if you recognize the Taliban formally in each corner of Afghanistan, in every province, district, and village, the ones who will suffer the most are women. When you recognize the Taliban, you might as well burn the women of Afghanistan. To avoid legitimizing the Taliban, it is essential to continue channeling aid through nonprofit and humanitarian organizations. We also need to step up our contributions, and every dollar counts, emphasizing support to women-run and women-focused organizations that are already operating on the ground, as well as support those communities and education sectors that do not discriminate against women. Furthermore, the United States, the European Union, and other governments should increase both funding and collaboration to help stabilize the Afghan economy. Of the 24 million people that desperately need help, the United Nations estimates that more than half are children. Choosing between letting one's child starve or marrying her off before the age of puberty should not be a decision that any parent should be forced to make. According to recent reports, the US is currently negotiating to unfreeze at least some of the Afghan central bank funds and place them under third-party management dependent on certain conditions. Just yesterday, unfortunately, this move was rejected by Afghanistan. They rejected a US plan which proposed the transfer of $3.5 billion of Afghan reserves to a fund in Switzerland to be dispersed for humanitarian purposes only, using a board of US, Swiss, and independent trustees. Unfortunately, the Taliban have rejected this. So that's more bad news coming outside from Afghanistan. Additionally, the international community, especially given instances such as what happened yesterday, should apply direct pressure to the Taliban without jeopardizing the welfare of the people in Afghanistan. As an example, travel bans and targeted sanctions could be imposed through a UN Security Council resolution. These sanctions and bans would clearly delineate the steps that must be taken to improve the situation for women and girls. We also need to support the relocation of women who are victims of gender-based violence, women's rights activists, and other civil society members whose lives are imminently threatened under the current regime. It is also imperative to weave peace and security into the fabric of not only our domestic but our foreign policy agenda, and to ensure that women play a prominent role. Because increasing evidence shows that involving women in peace and security efforts substantially improves the chances of success. A recent study by the International Peace Institute found that peace agreements created with women were 35% more likely to last 15 years or longer. The United States already recognizes the critical role that women play in preventing conflict. In 2017, it passed the Women, Peace and Security Act, the first comprehensive legislation of its kind globally. This means that a critical vehicle already exists for policy change, and some important initial steps have already been taken to advance its agenda. But we need to do much more, much faster. Now, the changes I've described pertain to what governments and the international organizations can do. But what about individuals? What can each and every one of us here do today in order to help ameliorate this horrific situation? One very important thing we can all do is to hold our leaders accountable, not just during election time, but also during the interim. We can write letters to members of Congress, place calls, sign petitions demanding action. We can also join social media campaigns for change, or perhaps even start one. On the financial side, We can donate to organizations fighting for women and girls in Afghanistan. And more importantly, we need to continue to advocate, raise awareness, and keep the spotlight on the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. This last point that I mentioned is very critical. Amid today's fast-paced media cycle, even humanitarian crisis and disasters like the one in Afghanistan unfortunately do not command the world's attention for long. The plight of women and girls in Afghanistan was essentially swept aside the moment Russia invaded Ukraine. Even the earthquake that devastated Afghanistan just a few months ago, claiming more than 1,000 lives and injuring over 6,000, barely registered on the newsfeed. It is therefore up to each and every one of us to raise awareness not only on the challenges confronting women and girls, but to also share their inspirational stories of courage and resilience. Letters to the editors, commentaries, blog posts. There are so many outlets to choose from these days, and it is essential to use them. But above all, we must not turn away. In all my years as a women's rights advocate, one thing never ceases to amaze me: the resilience of countless women in the midst of unimaginable hardship and discrimination. Afghanistan is replete with precisely this kind of woman. Last September, reporter Zahra Joya told The Guardian, "The Taliban can use their guns and their rules to try to break us, to try to break the spirit of Afghan women, but they can never silence us. I will never stop resisting." No matter what the risks, today women like Zahra continue to fight. And not just prominent women, but women from all walks of life. For several months after the Taliban takeover, thousands of women and girls took to the streets to protest in Herat, in Kabul, in Badakhshan. Even after violent reprisals, they kept showing up and continue to do so today, 1 year after the Taliban takeover. When the Taliban reopened girls' secondary schools in March, only to close them that same day, organizers created a rally in front of the Taliban Ministry of Education. Today, women around Afghanistan are using every means available to pursue their cause, whether it's encrypted phones, staying in safe houses, or even dressing up as men. Their courage in the face of adversity and violence is not only awe-inspiring, but remarkable. And the international community needs to do whatever it can in order to match their courage with action. Prominent Afghan journalist and women's rights activist Mahbouba Siraj captured this sentiment when she recently addressed the United Nations Security Council. While it feels as though the world has given up on us, we have not. We are on the streets protesting every day, despite the threats, despite the violence, despite the weapons. But we need your political support and resources to succeed. We need you to stand by us. Today, I believe it is our duty, not just as Americans, but as human beings, to stand by the women and girls of Afghanistan, to do everything in our power to bring an end to this horrific oppression, and to shift the pendulum once again toward a better and brighter future. Thank you.
Check, there we go. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come to these microphones.
And Elise and I will also bring it to you if you are in a place you don't feel like you can extract yourself from. So, please raise your hand.
Oh, I'm first? Okay. Thank you for that excellent presentation. It was very inspiring. I'd like to lend my voice in support of the recommendations that you mentioned with respect to supporting civil society in Afghanistan. There are many ways that this can be done.
Correct.
My name is Malcolm Phelps.
I
I oversaw education for Afghanistan at the U.S. Agency for International Development from 2012 to 2016.
Oh, wow.
So during that time, I spent about 18 months in Afghanistan. And during that time, you would go out in the morning, you would see children, boys and girls, walking to school. You would come home at night, you would see boys and girls walking home from school. I'm reminded of a time that I spent with about 20 students at the American University of Afghanistan, young people who were earning their master's degrees. There were 10 young men, 10 young women. All of them were working in positions of responsibility in business and industry, and they were doing extremely well. And they were earning their master's degree. In our programs in the rural areas of Afghanistan, we saw families, including fathers, who wanted to send their girls to school. The motivation, the dedication among the population is there. That is why I support what you said. If we can find ways to support those who are still there. Unfortunately, I'd venture to say that probably of those 20 students I met only a few years ago, I would venture to say that virtually all of them are out of the country now. They probably found ways to get out.
Sure.
But there is a base of support. And if we as a country and as a global community can find ways to provide that support to these civil society organizations and to these others, I know that it will pay benefits down the line. So forgive me, this was not a question.
No. I have a question to ask you.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you for your insight, because you were on the ground floor, and it makes a huge difference when you tell everyone, even me, that, fathers wanted their daughters to go to school. So obviously there is, not every, man in Afghanistan is against women's rights and education, etc. It's the Taliban and their antiquated ideology. Obviously, they adhere to a hardline interpretation of Islam, and part and parcel of that narrative, I know only too well because of Iran, is an inferior status for women. The only difference is that at least Iran, compared to Afghanistan, at least they allow women and girls to go to school. But that being said, it's important to remind everybody that the Taliban have in total ruled Afghanistan for five years. So the history I've just described outweighs that, okay? So they, in total, you're talking about an ideology that is probably alien to most of, am I correct, to most of the Afghan you tell me most of the Afghan population.
Well, it's absolutely correct. And what we found in our community-based education programs, which was conducted in rural areas where they did not have public schools and so forth, a focus was on getting more girls into school. What we found is that the resistance on the part of many of the male members of the household had nothing to do with religion or social traditions and so forth. It had to do with the opportunity cost of sending a young girl to school. If you send her to school, then she's not here to cook the meal and to do all the other things. If we could provide minimal monetary assistance to those families in the form of cooking oil or various other kinds of support to the family, they were thrilled to send their girls to school. So it is a myth that has anything to do with religion and so forth.
Thank you so much for that, for your insight. That was very helpful.
I have a question here, please. It's appalling to me that I have to come to an event to hear about this. I mean, I had no idea that this was happening in this country. And my question is, while we play political football with countries and leverage them for one party or the other's benefit, why aren't we as Americans getting true on the ground, grassroots opportunities to support things like this when women are suffering this badly in a country that we really had a lot of influence in over a long period of time? So do you know why we don't hear these stories, and why isn't it a political discussion in our country?
That's a great question. I ask myself that every day when it even comes to countries like Iran, which has been in the news for 43 years, but you only hear about the Iran nuclear deal, and the news media tends to overlook humanitarian issues, which is why as much as I'm not in favor of social media, I believe there's good and bad. So I use my social media platform to advocate for humanitarian issues. I don't know why the media, especially in the US, disregards and doesn't focus on safeguarding human rights. I also feel not enough is, like you mentioned, is being said. I don't know if anybody agrees with me. When I put the news on, I feel the same news is regurgitated every day. Okay, so I'm not the only one. Sometimes, I just don't listen anymore because it's Trump, the Mar-a-Lago raid, this, that. I mean, it's just Zelensky, Ukraine, this, and, a lot of Afghan women's rights activists have connected with me via Twitter, and this is exactly what they're saying. Why has the world turned away? So I believe that this is why I mentioned we need to keep our leaders accountable, not just during election time, but also during the interim time. And, when I talk about holding leaders accountable, we're talking about a hasty and chaotic withdrawal that I mentioned. And a lot of people tell me, well, it's not the US's job to babysit and provide, watch in a foreign country. And the truth of the matter is, when you talk to Afghan women, and even men, they say nobody expected the US to stay there indefinitely. It's neither sustainable nor realistic. What we were stunned about is that it was so chaotic the way the US left that it undermined any and all leverage that they had built to be able to negotiate an intra-Afghan deal and to, step up diplomacy. In fact, what is quite baffling to me is how President Biden ignored his top military commanders at the time, who recommended that they keep 2,500 troops on the ground for an additional month or two. We're talking an additional month or two. We're not talking years, okay? And in order to step up diplomacy and try to cement a deal, part and parcel of that was to look out for women and girls and their welfare, because obviously everybody in the world was cognizant of the Taliban and their notorious brand of gender apartheid. Why President Biden ignored that, the only explanation I could find that he gave is he felt every added day for the troops was a risk. Well, I'm thinking, so basically the way I look at it in a very layman's terms is, so the US spent 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Right, so that's how I look at it. So I'm not quite getting what happened, but even with, looking back at my country, I realize a lot of issues are politicized. They're not about human beings. There's a tendency, unfortunately, to put politics before people.
Yes.
Okay, and one of the things that every one of us can do, and I know a lot of people tell me, oh, who's gonna listen to me? I don't have many followers, I swear to God, every voice counts, because every one of us can only do so much. But I really, really cannot stress how much there is power in numbers. So if you don't hold your leaders accountable, if you don't continue to raise awareness, then all of the spotlight goes towards non-humanitarian issues for some reason. So it's every one of us in this room can help. I swear to God it works, and the advent of social media has made that possible. I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, a 22-year-old young woman in Iran was beaten by Iran's morality police for not wearing the veil properly. She went into a coma and died this morning. I swear to God this was not on the news. Okay, I put it up 3 times on my Twitter page. It's the same group of us who talk about this. President Biden just said, oh, we're very sorry to hear about that. But then he goes on and talks about the Iran nuclear deal. To me, if you want to talk about the Iran nuclear deal and you see such atrocities, why don't you make that part and parcel of the nuclear deal? Why do you not hold Iran? Okay, we'll do a deal with you, but if we're watching you and your humanitarian, whatever you're not doing, we're keeping a watch on you. This deal should be contingent upon how Iran treats its own citizens. Same thing with the Taliban. You know, I don't know why governments tend to overlook human rights issues time and time again. And I'm glad you brought this up. You never hear these stories, and I don't know why. Because maybe it doesn't serve somebody's political agenda. So, thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, like, thinking about like Trump administrations and like the door agreements with the Taliban and the way like they completely like excluded the previous like Afghan government, and how like during the Biden administration, like we all saw and were all shocked about how like the Western troops just left, ran away from Afghanistan, and also seeing afterwards how the United States basically like made a country starve, freezing like all the international funds and humanitarian aid. What, like, I don't know, the only explanation that I have is that like it was like an intention from the Western country to destabilize.
It was what? The only explanation you can say?
Like the Western countries like wanted to destabilize Afghanistan, you know, like to create chaos, because like I cannot see any other reason. And like I think like it would also make sense thinking about how much like Central Asia now is becoming like fundamental for China, and like the Road and Belt Initiative to connect commercially China and Europe. And like literally it's the only way I can explain all of this, because like Europe and the United States like are imperialistic countries, and I cannot understand or conceive how could they make like all these mistakes one after the others. Like
I understand what you're saying, and that's a great point. It's not I'm not a politician, obviously, but you know, politics does seep into human rights, obviously. I remember when the Iranian Revolution happened, I was 12, but I do remember a lot of Iranians were saying that President Carter back then didn't support the Shah, and in fact supported Khomeini's return. And I don't understand that, because Khomeini was actually referring to America as the Great Satan. So to be honest, I don't understand that either. You know, again, I believe in, if anybody's a politician in this room, by all means chime in, because I don't have a political mindset. But I think there are, like you said, underlying reasons that we don't know of. I remember at some point, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think President Biden was going to allocate part of these Afghan frozen funds to 9/11 victims. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I couldn't fathom why the people responsible for 9/11 were the Saudis. I mean, you know, it was not, I wasn't, and a lot of Afghan women and women's rights activists were appalled, because they were saying, you know, this money, again, he tried to do, you know, I'm being fair, just recently he wanted to release $3.5 billion of the funds, but obviously with supervision, which is correct. You can't just hand it over to the Taliban, because they're not going to use it for anything good. But he, you know, was strictly for humanitarian purposes, but the Taliban rejected it, because obviously they're not going to, just like the Islamic Republic, they're not going to tend to their own people. They're just going to use the money probably the same way the Islamic Republic does. They fund terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. But the one thing that is baffling to me, and I'm glad you brought this up, is besides putting Afghanistan as a nation in this horrific situation, part and parcel of which are 50% of the population, which is the female population, there's also, we have to think about the threat of violent extremism in that region. You know, safety and security, given that the Taliban are ideologically not opposed to violence and not opposed to terrorist actions. So that's a load to walk away from, you know. So why, you know, if you think about it from that lens, there are so many things wrong with what happened just a year ago, so many things wrong. But again, I'm not, if anybody's a politician in this room, I would be happy to hear their point of view.
Well, I'm not a politician.
You are?
I am not.
Oh, I thought you said you are. I said,
I know I'm not a politician. But I have more pointed questions, and let me preface that with the statement that I think what we're talking about here is social change that we want to happen. Mm-hmm. And everything I've ever studied says social change takes a lot longer than I ever want things. You know, I mean, like, when I was younger, I thought I could make social change happen in a few years. Well, as I've grown older, I found that it won't happen in my lifetime, some of the things that I think needs to happen. And the other part of it is it's very difficult to effect those kinds of social changes that you want to change, or we all want to change, in Afghanistan, in Iran. But the question is, and maybe you have a better answer, how does one make it, how do you monetize that, and how do you do that from afar if you can't get in and actually work with the people and help them see that there's a better way to live?
Well, the people, look, to speak to your point, the 2 decades that the U.S. was involved, okay, saw tremendous progress, and I'll just be very clear that although gender equality was never a flagship priority of the previous government, in only 2 decades, there was tremendous progress made by women and girls, and they willingly did it. Nobody forced them to go to school. Nobody forced them to, you know, go into different sectors. They were very willing to embrace those changes. As the gentleman said, you know, can you echo, I'm echoing your sentiments on the ground floor. These changes were even embraced by the men in the family. And let me just also clarify that approximately 2/3 of Afghanistan's female population is under the age of 30. What does that mean? That means that the majority of the female populations have actually never lived their lives under Taliban rule, which is actually explains the progress made. Okay, so they were never privy to those horrific gender ideology that was advocated by the Taliban. So there was a lot of change in 2 decades, and those changes were obviously embraced. Otherwise, they would not have made such tremendous strides in 2 decades. So you're talking about social change, takes a long time, I agree, but Afghanistan is a perfect example of a country where the young population embraced these changes. And really, really, you know, you're talking about approximately 50% of the population, I described it, they're sitting at home with nothing to do. You saw in this video when the girls heard they couldn't go to school, they were devastated. What are they doing? They're going to school in secret. Okay, so they did embrace those changes. So, to your point, it does take a long time for social change to take root, and it was taking root. And the U.S. just was responsible partly for those changes and reforms. But as I mentioned, women's rights is not new in Afghanistan. Opportunities for women to enter different professions, to get an education is not new. As I mentioned, you have to go back in time in order to look at the present, meaning, are these changes new? No. Afghanistan, a year after Great Britain gave women the right to vote. The US, women were not given the right to vote until 1920. Even then, only white women were given the right to vote. Black women did not get the right to vote till 1965. So when you look at Afghanistan's history, where women and reform are concerned, it has, it has a rich and complex history like Iran. It's varied, but it's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that the US imported. The groundwork and the foundational principles were already there. And as I mentioned, the various monarchs who embedded the reforms.
Hi, my name is Sophia Penner, and I teach poli-sci here at the college. So I'm not a politician, but I am a political scientist, which are two different things.
It's better than what I do. I'm a historian.
Well, I actually have at least one student here in the audience in my current class, and a couple days ago we were talking about Orientalism. And for those who maybe aren't familiar, one part of Edward Said's critique of Western approaches to the quote-unquote East, primarily the Muslim world, has to do with the way in which Westerners like to focus on issues like the oppression of women, not necessarily out of a sincere concern for women or a sincere desire to help, but as a way of creating a sort of distorted mirror that makes us feel better about ourselves and about our own failings on this front and on other fronts. And so I'm curious, when you think about what people can do on social media, what people can do in writing letters to the editor, what you would suggest for people to be able to do this in a way that doesn't, in fact, reproduce a dynamic where Americans just go home at the end of the day feeling better about themselves rather than actually having a sincere concern for the women of Afghanistan?
That's a great question. Yesterday I spoke at World Denver, and we had quite a few Afghan students in the audience. And I think any one of us can talk about these horrific situations, but hearing it from their perspective is powerful. So they actually were very courageous. They stood up. A lot of them all actually said they're still traumatized by what they saw. There was a lot of emotion in the room because, one of the young ladies actually spoke even. She actually stopped speaking because she said it was very difficult for her to speak. I suggested to them, because I can say only so much that can resonate with a Western audience, like you mentioned. And again, I'm not your typical Western audience. I'm from Iran, but I have not been back to Iran for a long time. I actually recommended that they write blog posts and share their stories, because when you hear it from their perspective, because all of them had no, as I said, they're in their early 20s, they had no memory of the Taliban. So they grew up in an environment where they could go to school, they saw their mothers working, like the gentleman described, it was not an oppressive society per se. And they actually said they were going to do that. I said, your voices are power. And when people see things from your perspective, it's different than mine. And we're not talking about if someone wants to wear the hijab or not. That's not the issue. That's become such a Western symbol of oppression, unfortunately. But just young women who recently left Afghanistan, what this has meant for them and how this has changed their lives from their perspective, not from my perspective or your perspective, but from their perspective. So because this is a very new occurrence, not only it's just a year, I think the more voices we hear from Afghanistan, the more we'll have a sense of what the depth of, what they're talking about is. Otherwise, I can provide my perspective, you can provide yours, but I think the most powerful perspectives come from the women and girls themselves, which is why I quoted a lot of women, because when you hear it from them, you know what they're asking for, you know how they're looking at the situation, and you know what they are working towards and how they're asking for help. Because, you can't put women in a universal scope. Every woman has to be, women have different needs. Some women, for example, I don't use the term feminism, and a lot of people use the term feminism. I think women's rights and feminism means different things for different women. And I'm glad you brought up Edward Said. I actually, because I'm a graduate of Columbia University, I actually had the privilege of being a student in one of his classes before he passed away. So thank you for bringing him up. I brought back a lot of memories. Hi.
That's okay. My name is Julie Richmond, and
Can you get a little close? Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so is that good? Yes. Okay, my name is Julie Richmond. I'm a member of the Colorado Springs community, and I've been fortunate to have befriended a family from Afghanistan, from Kabul, and they fled last year. A family of 5, Razia, her husband Mohammed, their 3 children, Hosna, Hasina, and Mustafa. And a lot of us have surrounded them with love, help, support, whatever they needed. A group of us have helped them since last year. And I feel really blessed to have met them, and I know how hard the situation is because of the Sarwari family. I'm a feminist, the daughter of a civil rights worker, a feminist leader in Colorado. My late mother, Eleanor Miller Greenberg, was a member of the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame. And I follow in my mom's footsteps because that's what I do. And so I'm really glad to have heard you tonight and to hear about a lot of what you're saying. I do feel hopeful, but as you said, it sort of goes a couple steps forward and a couple steps back. So
thank you for that. I actually, when I meant feminism, I don't like to label myself,
right. Mm-hmm.
But I believe in equality for women.
And women's rights.
To your point, first of all, you're a remarkable human being, for honestly.
Everybody's helped them.
Yeah, but you're a remarkable human being, and if everybody was like you, the world would be a much better place.
I just have one more thing to share.
Yes.
My late father-in-law, Kiva Richmond, escaped the Holocaust with his parents from Niszczelsk, Poland. And he came to America with his parents and settled in Buffalo. And the family name was Richmond, and now it's Richmond. And so I'm blessed in that way also. And I understand these issues.
You should, can I ask you, have you ever written a blog post or shared yours? You should, you know.
Well, I do have, I'm a freelance opinion writer for the Gazette neighborhood newspapers. Mm-hmm. And I used to be the correspondent from Colorado Springs for the Intermountain Jewish News. So if you share your stories, those are powerful. Yeah, I will, I promise. And you have a lovely lady. Can you please stand up? If every one of us does what this lovely lady has done, can you imagine the difference we can make? So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also wanted to say about social change. I agree with you that social change, in order to last, takes a long time, but there have been so many instances in history where one person who dared to defy conventional norms made a huge difference. For example, Rosa Parks, let's not forget, one woman refusing to vacate her bus seat, and it resulted in the end of legalized segregation in this country. So that's why I said don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Dr. Ansary, we're going to have 2 comments/questions here, and then we'll finish up. It'll be myself and then Ed to my right here. You asked if there are any politicians in the House, so I'm going to take my Colorado Springs World Affairs Board of Directors hat off. I'm going to put my Vice Chair of the El Paso County Republican Party hat on. And there's two answers, I think, to your question. One, why do we hear about it? I think there's battle fatigue, there's conflict fatigue. I'm not saying it's right, but I think that is probably something that plays in it, that people are tired, not tired of women or women's rights and so on, but they're tired of conflict. And I think that's playing a big part in why we don't see it on the front page of the Washington Post, that we don't necessarily get those stories written in the Gazette or other media platforms. The second question is why? I think we see it internally in our own country, the internal displacement of refugees and people seeking a new life here in America, and how our elected leaders are shuffling them around as pawns on some chessboard. I think that type of depraved indifference is indicative of the decay of my political party and of society writ large, in that people don't necessarily stand up, get out, contact your elected officials, and demand that they treat human beings with respect and dignity, no matter where they come from, no matter what color of their skin, no matter what language they speak. So to answer your question, the why, I think that those leaders that are doing those things, especially here in this country, lack character or any type of moral direction. And next we'll hear from them.
Can I ask you a huge favor? Can you run for office? Yeah, I would vote for you. Thank you. That was perfect. Thank you.
My name is Eddie Mujic. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Springs. So you talked about Biden administration and failure of withdrawal and what we can do about it, etc., etc., etc. I'm coming from Bosnia, and I've been doing the war over there, and etc. When Bosnia was in war, the UN Security Council, just a year before that, imposed arms embargo on all former Yugoslavian republics. So we basically had to either smuggle weapons or, get some other way from various sources. So when Afghanistan government collapsed in the way it did, one of my friends said that if we had so much help and weapons, we would be in Berlin in 1995. So my question is that, yes, sure, that was very chaotic, and a lot of things could be done differently. But what about Afghanistan and a government? I mean, you are correct. We took down the Taliban just to replace it at the Taliban. But in 20 years, there's so much institution building that happened in Afghanistan, and then just collapsed just like that. So can you talk more about that? And actually that responsibility of Afghanis itself when it comes to this issue?
That's a great question. Yesterday, as I mentioned, there was a number of students from Afghanistan in the audience, including a gentleman, and this question came up yesterday, and we actually asked one of the students, because he volunteered to discuss this. It's a great point. He said in the 20 years that the U.S. was there was never any effort made to cultivate anyone who would be able to take over and run Afghanistan. And that's a great point. So yes, the US was there and there was tremendous progress made, but for some reason, and we asked him because he just left a year ago, when you look back, there was no effort put in by the US, by the Afghan people, to cultivate someone who would be able to take over and follow in the footsteps of what the US had implanted, right? So, of course, when you look back, this is another blunder, okay? And as I said, it's not just the US. I don't want to play the blame game, but the fact is that I think everyone is culpable in that you did great work, but you didn't think, who's going to replace all the wonderful work that I've done, all the progress that's been made. There's only one entity left, and they're waiting for you to leave, So when you leave, let's just say, and he said that. He said, when we look back, we were, living a nice life. We never thought this would happen. This pretty much happened overnight. But nobody was thinking in the 20 years, who can we groom in order to take over? And that's a great point. That's a great point. You know, I say the same thing about Iran. A lot of people say regime change, right? I always say, well, let's say this regime leaves. Who's going to take over? They've been ruling for 43 years. It's not just the supreme leader. There's the IRGC, which is the most powerful entity, and they have deep roots. So let's just say the supreme leader and his constituents leave, okay? Who's going to take, is there anybody, is there a knight in shining armor who's going to come and take over a country? No. So when people say, let's topple the regime, right? Well, okay, let's think what's going to happen, like you said, the day after, you know? No one is guarding that country to say, oh, when this regime leaves, we're going to come take over and make it into a utopia again. Same thing with the US. They did great work. There was great progress. But everybody missed the boat, which you brought up, okay? That boat is what happens the day we leave. What happens the day after the US leaves? Nobody thought about that, and this is what this gentleman said yesterday. Nobody was focusing on that. Which is why the Taliban is thriving, because there's no opposition groups, per se.
We have several.
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine, of course. If everybody else is, I'm fine. Again, I'm not a politician.
This question goes about a lot of roots about politics, and what you've said throughout the speech is we focus on politics more than human. Our news is a lot more repetitive than we would like to admit. And there's a lot more ignorance in America than we can ever point to. So the question is, what can we do to be able to create more thought into what humane societies actually exist? Humane programs and the news we should be paying attention to. The question is very hard to answer because we're moving towards social media. We're moving towards very quick information giving. Reading an article as long as what the New York Times does is something people don't entertain. So for myself, I would only like to say the thing that has brought the most amount of knowledge into humane issues is reading the Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera?
Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you to advocate some great avenues for us to pay attention to in the future.
Thank you for that question. I don't read the New York Times anymore. I don't really read the mainstream ones because they've become so polarized. So I stay away from the New York Times, Washington Post, and I'm not putting anybody down. I just feel they provide a one-sided perspective. Al Jazeera is one that I look at. BBC is actually great. They provide a very middle-of-the-road perspective. As again, being from Iran, there's so many nuances to what's happening in the world, in different countries. So I actually go to the more foreign outlets, provide a better perspective, and I'm glad you brought up, this is a great question. Unfortunately, I don't look at the US outlets anymore. I don't read any of them. They're just very, very either far right or far left. There's very rarely do you get a middle-of-the-road perspective which provides both sides and offers a fair and rational assessment. So Al Jazeera is great, BBC is great, The Guardian is very good as well. I was going to think one more that I look at. I don't listen to the news anymore in this country, to be honest. It's just kind of almost infuriating, to be honest. But I'm thinking, the other one, I just blanked on it. I'll remember, I'll get back to you. There's one more that I look at, but I blanked on. Al Jazeera, BBC, The Guardian, and there's one more. NPR is very good too. NPR is great. Hi.
Hi.
We took a couple of pictures together.
Yes. It's so honored to meet Dr. Ansary for this, interview and this your conversation. Listening to your presentation, I really enjoyed
Thank you.
every stuff because after the Taliban's conquest, I followed the every step. Oh, I don't speak really loudly. Okay, for my question is kind of the really politics because if I read some news about the current situation about Taliban, and if that's incorrect, please point out. The American and then the Western worlds, they use approach to protest the terrorism and the women oppression by Taliban, just to cut, cut the financial exchange with the World Bank. And then it's just as you said, most of the Taliban person, they are in the starving situation. Don't you think over the, kind of the aggressive approach will do another second harm for the women in Afghanistan? And then I want to hear some insight from you about that.
Are you asking about
The Taliban.
the Taliban and using strong force to force the women?
No, my question is because I learned so far about how the Western world their approach to protest the terrorism and then the women oppression, just by stop the financial interact with Taliban, and then finally result kind of the poverty in that old Afghan. And then I think it's maybe this aggressive approach maybe will cause the second harm to the women in that place. So I want to listen about your insight. I want to hear about more specific practical approach.
You're
to help
talking
the
what the international community can do to hold the Taliban accountable for their oppression? Is that what you're asking, some of the measures that can be implemented?
Like the World Bank.
Yes.
Right, so one of the things I mentioned was travel ban, and the other was to, targeted sanctions. As I mentioned, the other thing that I'm actually appalled that's never enforced, there should be international standards for human rights violations of this magnitude. And if you allow countries to undertake their atrocities over and over again without any repercussions from the international community, they're going to keep doing it. So what I'm appalled at is there are no international human rights standards by which to hold these regimes accountable. And again, that's not a question for me, but that's one of the reasons you see so many atrocities around the world, because nobody holds anybody accountable. They just do it and keep doing it. Again, another country that's done it for 43 years is Iran. But I think these things can be done. If I'm not mistaken, again, I'm not a politician, you're the politician. I think the Reagan administration actually, when negotiating arms deals with Russia, they actually made it contingent upon how the Russians treated their own citizens. Am I correct? I think they actually did that. So there is a platform that when you negotiate and want to make deals with countries that don't treat their citizens properly, you can actually implement a human rights agenda, which I think President Reagan did. So that platform exists. So one of the things is not to deal with them, to impose certain restrictions on them, and to also hold them accountable when negotiating with them. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Shall we take this last one?
Of course.
One last question.
Of
Sorry
course.
about that.
No.
A little bit more concrete than what we've been talking about. I'm curious, what are the forms of communication that are going on between the U.S. and the world with Afghan-run community ground?
Well, initially, there were sponsorship opportunities. I actually signed up for one. I was contacted by the State Department, given my line of work, and I agreed. It was me and another. I won't name the lady. Well, I'll name her. It's okay. The lady they asked me if I would sponsor was one of the first female mayors in Afghanistan, the youngest female mayor, Zarifa Ghaffari. So Zarifa had fled Afghanistan, and she was kind of in a holding tank in Turkey. And I got contacted by Ambassador Kelly Curry, who was the second female ambassador for global women's issues. And she said that they had started, the US government had started, this was not even 8-9 months ago, a sponsorship program in order to bring families here and help them get settled. And she said there was a lady in Washington who was willing to provide Zarifa. Zarifa's father was killed by the Taliban. She, right now, probably not even 30. She's married and she has 7 or 8 siblings under the age of 16. So she said there's a lovely lady in Washington who has a home that she's willing to give Zarifa for as long as she wants in her family. And if I'd be willing to, given my line of work, provide employment for her, and I said absolutely. So I remember you go through a grueling process of filling out applications, and then the rest is up to the State Department. One of the mandates the State Department has is they need to make sure that the person you sponsor cannot go back to Afghanistan because given their line of work, their life might be in imminent danger. So, long story short, the State Department approved Zarifa's application, the dual sponsorship, and about 2 weeks later, I get a call that they've reneged on it. Why? Because Zarifa decided to go back to Afghanistan for 72 hours because her husband had another family and he had kids that he wanted to see. I don't think Zarifa quite understood the magnitude of what this meant because she and I were on touch via Signal and WhatsApp, and she called me and she was obviously very disappointed. And I said, there's nothing I can do. So I know there are sponsorship opportunities that the U.S. was offering, even now. So those, but the sponsorship opportunities, yeah.
I worked with Afghan resettlement for about 3 months in Columbia, Missouri. And so I got to know the process very well. I'm curious though, what are the most updated forms of information that we're getting from the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, right now it's, through the regular channels, you can come to the U.S.
Right.
But again, the same way I came to the U.S., the regular immigration channels. So it is possible. Again, if you're able to provide home, shelter, accommodations, it is possible to do that. It's not, that this information, like you say, is not readily out there, which is why I asked the lovely lady there to talk about it more. Because there are countless families who need help, but if there's no facilitator, then they don't know what to do. But the regular immigration channels, as far as I know, it is possible to come to this country and immigrate like everybody else. Those doors are open.
Have you found it particularly difficult to find updated communications?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's not readily available. It's kind of like you have to dig. But again, if you want to sponsor a family, the opportunity's there, but that information is not readily available either. The sponsorship comes with a lot of contingencies, specifically for the Afghan people. So you need to make sure you abide by them because the State Department is very quick to take that away, and I had firsthand experience. Even just going to Afghanistan for 5 minutes completely took away her sponsorship opportunity. So, but that information, again, Zarifa was telling me she didn't know. Again, speaks to your point. She was under the impression that, she could not risk living there indefinitely given who she was. She said she just went for like 72 hours to accompany her husband. Again, they weren't very clear. She thought it meant like for a long-term period. So I'm glad you brought this up, but this information you have to dig for. Even the people who are involved like myself, I didn't know it meant. I even told her I didn't think going 3 days meant it would derail the whole process.
Thank you.
Which is why you should definitely write about this. You really should. I think it's such a beautiful, powerful story.
I will.
Okay.
Dr. Ansary, I just wanted to say thank you very much. Give her a big round of applause.